Welcome to Charter California Edition. I'm Brad Pomerantz. He is with us again. His name is Bill Lockyer. He is the treasurer of the state of California. And so I want to speak with you about what's going on in Washington. As we speak today, we still are in the midst of a shutdown. The debt crisis is before us. This may air before or after any of those are resolved, but I still think these are important topics to discuss.
Sure.
And so I'd like you to indulge me if you may.
Well, they seem to repeat also.
They do repeat also. And although what's interesting, though, is the last federal government shutdown we had was, about 17 years ago. That one feels different than this one. You were at that point, were you pro tem of the Senate in the mid-90s?
I was in the Senate, yeah.
Okay, so could you kind of compare and contrast those two and look at how they impact California?
My recollection is it didn't last very long. Mm-hmm. So it was sort of the Newt Gingrich and the Republicans quickly were criticized for it. Clinton seemed to shift the blame entirely to them.
Right.
And so it was over fast.
But what's interesting about the current crisis is if you looked at early polling, it seemed as if the Republicans were getting a lot of the flack, but not an overwhelming amount of it. But as we've gone deeper and deeper, it seems as if the country is really turning on the Republicans and pointing their fingers at them and saying, you're in the wrong. Is that your analysis?
Well, there's plenty of blame for everybody, and there's always a public skepticism about anybody in politics that we don't like any of them.
Of course.
They're all, but in this instance, there seems to be a broad understanding that the shutdown is caused by Republicans saying we're not going to vote for a budget unless there are changes in policy that they're demanding. And even though the policy may or may not be popular, depending on where you are, just the fact that you're not just doing your job seems to come through.
I want to get a sense, and I want to focus first on the shutdown side.
Sure.
It's hard to really quantify, if you're not a federal worker, how the shutdown impacts Californians.
Right.
Are there impacts beyond our friends who work in the federal government, and we honor them and are sorry that they're suffering?
Well, there are a lot of them, but one of them is my daughter who works at NASA in Northern California, and she calls and says, Dad, we all were on the first day given an unemployment insurance form and told apply. Well, there's probably a couple 100,000 of those people in the state of California. Now, if they're all applying for unemployment, then there's a burden on the state that didn't happen the first time.
No doubt.
And of course, their spending or whatever might be impacted, although we're confident they'll get paid.
Right.
But there are other impacts on Head Start, mostly programs for poor and disadvantaged. Food stamps, Head Starts, things of that sort.
Aside from the sequester.
Yes.
So, because the sequester we know impacted some of those programs.
Yes.
Let's talk about the debt ceiling.
And then contractors, I should add. The contractors in doing private sector defense work or something, they aren't getting paid on time.
And our national parks, we've heard the stories. Yosemite is being impacted, and they just suffered tremendously with the fires as well. I want to talk about the debt ceiling. And I ask you specifically because you are the treasurer and you know a lot about debt and how we handle our debt and bond entitlements or indebtedness, et cetera. So some of our friends on the Republican side have said, it's not a big deal if we blow through the debt ceiling. We have the money and we'll pay our interest as required, and it's really okay. What's your sense of that viewpoint?
Well, a couple of things. There are some immediate impacts. Maybe they can disaggregate the 4 million bills they pay every day.
4 million, wow.
And say, here's the amount that's debt, and here's something else. But we have to kind of keep in mind we're the strongest economy on the planet. The dollar and treasury bills are the most solid, liquid instrument of finance used all over the world. It's under pressure in a number of ways. There are emerging economies, especially in Asia, saying, well, we don't want the dollar to be the unit of business for the planet. How about us?
The yen.
Or how about a new...
The euro.
Something new, or a new global money. Well, that hurts us. And so it's hard to calculate the amount, but long term that hurts American businesses.
It's the optics, as you would say.
Well, it's probably more practical than
Really?
that. Yeah. Then there's sort of reputational things like, well, this is a country that doesn't pay its bills. Now, independently of that, the only empirical evidence that we've got, 2 years ago, they got right to the edge of the debt ceiling and then they voted for it. Even then, consumer confidence, just getting close, dropped 22%.
Wow.
People lost household income $2.4 trillion. Now, why would anyone say, gee, that's okay? It's market losses and values of assets and so on. So, and that was when they didn't even default. Right. It was a maybe.
But it does beg the question, we do have the sequester, and so we're spending less money. Why is it that we continue to have to increase the debt limit? It's troublesome for our children and grandchildren.
Well, there still are traditional borrowings, where you're borrowing to build something and you have a bond and that sort of thing. There's all of this new money the Fed is putting into the economy to pump up the economy. But principally, they're spending more than the revenues coming in, even though they've made big cuts.
The sequester was really very significant.
Yeah, they cut $1.5 trillion
and
over
yet
long
we
term.
Still need to increase the debt ceiling.
Well, the debt grows.
Right.
Now, it is interesting because it's also a derivative of the economy. So if the economy is robust, the debt goes down. So it is interesting. Conservative economists have now realized this is kind of like generals preparing for the last war. The debt argument is this script written when the problem is going away. So it's not a long-term problem like people.
It is?
No, it's not.
It's not. You feel like we are starting
we're
to
on
get
the
a
right
handle.
track. Yes, and so even the conservative calculations and forecasts by the think tanks show that the debt diminishes unless there's new expenditures like Afghanistan or Iraq where we're put on the credit card.
And speaking of debt, I know that you have been a significant advocate for the state of California to decrease its debt.
Right.
Because over the last several years, our debt has increased. We have bonds that we haven't been using efficiently, effectively, but there's some good news on the California bond front.
Oh yeah, a lot actually.
Tell us about it, please.
Well, there's a lot of things. We do short-term borrowing because of cash flow. And so, a lot of the money comes in April 15th, that kind of thing. And so when we did short-term borrowing recently, we got the lowest interest rates in 40 years. Because the market has been good for issuers, we've been refinancing old debt. And just in the last few years, probably saved about $1.5 billion in what we would have paid.
And are we not paying down debt as
Yes,
well?
we are. So that's the other thing the governor talks about is the wall of debt. So there was a lot of deferrals and internal borrowing against every account and so on. There was probably $35 billion of that when Jerry became governor. Now it's on a schedule so that 3 years from now, it'll be about $4.7 billion. So that's an 86% reduction in that internal debt.
Quite significant.
That's good.
The good news seems to be coming to Sacramento, to Washington. We'll see. When we come back, we'll be speaking with Gary DeLong. He is a councilman in Long Beach. We'll get his sense on how the shutdown is impacting municipalities in our state of California. Treasurer Bill Lockyer, thank you so much for joining us. I'm Brad Pomerantz. We'll be right back on Charter California Edition.
In what year did the United States experience its first federal government shutdown?
Welcome back to Charter California Edition. I'm Brad Pomerantz. Our guest, Gary DeLong, he's a member of the Long Beach City Council. And so I want to speak with you about the government shutdown. As we speak today, we are still in the midst of it. By the time this airs, we may be out of it. But that being said, I do think it's an important conversation to have, especially given that you represent one of the largest cities in the state, in the country for that matter, over 500,000, about 500,000 people. What's your sense of how this government shutdown and any government shutdown, how does it impact cities, major cities like Long Beach?
Well, first of all, let's be clear, it's a federal government shutdown.
Right.
The city of Long Beach is still open for business.
Right, as is the state of California.
Absolutely.
And what's interesting is people had thought that if the shutdown occurred, that somehow that would impact the implementation of Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act, but it really doesn't because the exchanges are run through the states.
That's right. Certainly the computer problems had an impact on the introduction of the Affordable Care Act.
Right, but that's not
not
as a
the
result
budget.
of a federal shutdown.
Exactly.
So
right.
let's do...
But there could be some problems to the city at some point. Since we're early into the shutdown,
Right.
we haven't felt any of those yet, but there could be significant impacts.
And I do want to talk about them because, again, whether this airs before, after, or during the shutdown, not relevant. We know that these issues could surface in the future. And when I think about Long Beach, the first thing I think about is the Long Beach Port.
Absolutely.
Which is such a huge driver for the Long Beach economy, the Southern California economy, the California economy. I mean...
And that's what's important about it, right? It is a regional economic engine. And there are concerns. For example, if the federal government shutdown continues for an extended period of time, customs is going to slow, container volume going through the ports are going to slow, the number of ships coming into the port are going to start backing up, they're going to start looking for other ports perhaps. So it could definitely have a very negative impact on the U.S. government economy.
That's an understatement. I mean, it
is.
really could be quite dramatic. I mean, Long Beach, Los Angeles, the Twin Ports, they're a huge driver in this region.
Now you would hope, right, that Congress would pass some legislation that said, let's fund anything that supports the economy. However, from what we've seen recently, that doesn't appear to be happening.
Right, the piecemeal approach doesn't seem to be one that can pass both houses, get bipartisan support. What about safety at the port? Because that obviously is a major concern. One would presume, and I don't want to be hyperbolic, but the port could be a target.
It could be, but safety is always fully funded. So we don't have any federal government funding that if it doesn't come in, we're going to reduce the safety at the Port of Long Beach. And the same thing for the Port of Los Angeles. So we fully fund the safety requirements of that. But where you might see some impacts in the city is, for example, our health department. Part of its funding comes from grants for the federal government. Those will cease coming in. Section 8 housing depends on
So
the
let's talk,
federal
I want
government.
to split this up if we can. We'll talk about the health department because we had mentioned the Affordable Care Act, and that's run through the state, at least the exchanges. The Medicaid expansion would be through the state, and therefore, if you do apply for a Medicaid expansion, that's through the county. But like you said, this isn't LA County we're talking about Long Beach City, but
And what's unusual about the city of Long Beach is we have our own health department. So
why is that? You're special?
Exactly.
No, but why is it because it's a major city?
Because we've shown that we get bang for the bucks. We get a good return. It costs us very little as a city to have our health department. Very little general fund dollars go into it. And we have county and state and federal funds, and we feel we can provide a better service for our residents than a larger entity could.
So what does the health department provide in Long Beach as an example?
Well, for immunizations.
Oh, I see.
Would be an example.
Is there a hospital affiliated?
Flu shots. Well, we have a partnership with all the major hospitals in the area.
So, as you mentioned, there is a financial attachment with the Long Beach Health Department and the federal government.
Yes. So, for example, at some point, we would just cease offering any service that was funded with a federal grant. We just wouldn't be able to provide that service.
Am I to presume that that funding has stopped?
The funding, I think, will stop in November.
Okay, so as we speak,
yes.
Okay. What about housing? Because that's another area where the federal government does get involved.
That's right. The federal government provides Section 8 housing for low-income residents. And while that isn't a high percentage of the city of Long Beach, it is a percentage. And so if these folks don't have their Section 8 vouchers coming in, then landlords are potentially not going to continue to provide those housing units. Now, where do those people go?
And then there's the question of workforce development, which with our economy being tenuous as we speak, I mean, we appear to be on a recovery, but there's a lot of concern that the government could send us right into another recession. Right. Talk to us about workforce development.
So Long Beach is actually a leader in workforce development. Not only do we provide workforce development programs in our city, but we've had other surrounding cities over the last couple of years look at us and say, you do a great job. How about if we give you the federal money that we get for workforce development, and would you provide the services to our city? And we've done that. So now we call it the Pacific Gateway rather than just the city of Long Beach. But again, if the federal government dollars stop coming in, we will stop providing those services. We will not fund it with the general fund.
So there's no question that a federal shutdown does impact cities.
It will sooner or later.
It can impact cities.
Candidly, as opposed to sequestration, where we're months later and we haven't had any impact from sequestration.
Explain.
None.
Do you have a sense as to why sequestration doesn't seem to have impacted cities?
Well, I would speculate that the sequestration took a percentage. So it didn't say, I'm shutting your program down entirely. It said you had to be more efficient. You need to cut 2% or 7% or 11%, depending on your department, but you could still provide that service. A shutdown goes from 100% to 0%.
But the key thing to remember is, and we hear this is considered a partial government shutdown. It's complicated, it's confusing, but certain programs are funded outside of what we know as the continuing resolution.
Military, for example.
Right. That, although there's been a lot of consternation about the elimination of death benefits.
Yes, which I think is just plain wrong.
Right.
So we should be doing that.
So what are your constituents saying to you, if anything? I mean, is there chatter about this?
Yes, but the chatter is, and frankly, it's not political party oriented, but the chatter is, why can't those people get their act together and move it forward? You know, why are we, citizens, why are we suffering because they can't work together in Congress?
So that begs the question, because I don't want to take a partisan position, but if you just look at the linkage, what the Republicans have said is, unless you defund the Affordable Care Act, we will not pass a continuing resolution.
I think that was their beginning position, which I completely disagree with.
Okay, so, but here we are today, and there still seems to be fights over the Affordable Care Act. What are you hearing about that? Amongst your constituents. When we look at the early numbers, it does seem that many more people are at least going to Cover California's website to consider applying for health care.
What I hear from my constituents is they feel that battle has been fought and decided already. Many don't like it, many do, but that's in the past, and we need to look forward. Are there opportunities to improve the Affordable Care Act? There certainly are, and hopefully the Republicans and Democrats can work together to make that happen. But the issue now really should be about debt ceiling. It should be about national deficits. It should be about spending more money than we're taking in. That should be the conversation.
So what's going on? I mean, look, you ran for Congress last
year.
I did. You know these issues. What's happening back there? You spent a lot of time back there. Why can't? I mean, look, when Bill Clinton and Newt Gingrich were fighting, it felt different.
It did, or Tip O'Neill and Ronald Reagan.
Exactly. It felt very different. This seems really acrimonious. I mean, beyond just your typical, we're in opposite parties.
And if you look at it, from what I hear, firsthand, is they're more interested in scoring points against the other person than they are about actually solving something. And that needs to change. Whether it's the Republicans that want to attack the Affordable Care Act, which they know is non-negotiable for the Democrats, or it's the Democrats saying, we're not going to compromise one iota, and the Republicans saying, well, if you're not going to compromise, we're not going to deal with you. It is absolutely crazy what's going on.
So where do we go from here?
I think what we need to do is we need to look for those voices of reason. I mean, who's going to come out of this mess that's articulating, I don't know if you want to call it a moderate position or someone that's able to collaborate. Who are those people that say, look, I just want to work together and get this
Let's
fixed?
talk about the voices of reason, because I think it's fair to say that when you were running for Congress, you were seen as, quote, a moderate Republican. And when you look at the Republican caucus now, the quote, moderate Republicans, they're trying to talk out to pass a clean continuing resolution, but yet their voices don't seem to be heard.
Well, I think that they are, but on the other hand, what I'm looking for is somebody that really can come up with something that both sides compromises. Because candidly, a clean resolution doesn't serve any of the Republicans well. So they need to come up with something that says, look, Republicans, you need to move away from the Affordable Care Act, but we will help reduce the expense of government. Democrats, we're going to...
Which I think the Democrats probably would jump on that bandwagon.
If done appropriately, and not after you've attacked them night and day about the Affordable Care Act, they're going to be less willing to work with you. You need to build trust. It's got to be a trust issue.
Do you think we can get there?
I think we have to get there. And in fact, I will tell you that if we don't get there now, it's going to get worse and worse and worse. We're going to start seeing this as commonplace.
Okay, his name is Gary DeLong, member of the Long Beach City Council. When we come back, we'll be speaking with one of his colleagues. His name is Al Austin. My name is Brad Pomerantz. We'll be right back on Charter California Edition.
How long did the federal government partial shutdown in 1995-96 last in total?
Welcome back to Charter California Edition. My name is Brad Pomerantz. Our guest is Al Austin. He is a member of the Long Beach City Council. And so I want to speak with you about firearms, guns, weapons. You know, if we were talking 8 months ago, let's say, it seemed as if we'd have passed a national solution to what some see as a scourge on our society. Others see it as the right under the Second Amendment. But be that as it may, what we know is that certain states and certain municipalities are taking their own approach to gun violence, gun rights, gun control. Long Beach is one of them.
Yes, we are.
And let's talk about what's known as prohibited possessors. What exactly is a prohibited possessor?
A prohibited possessor is a individual who is mandated by the court or is identified as somebody by the court, by a judge, who should not be in possession of a firearm.
So it could be because they were convicted of a crime.
Convicted of a crime, domestic violence, a violent crime. They may have a
mental illness.
Right. And there's a database in the state of these prohibited possessors.
And what's interesting is, in the wake of the failure of Mansion Toomey, which would appear to be the federal response to gun violence, the state of California passed what's known as SB 140. And that was a bill back in May where about $24 million was appropriated so that additional law enforcement agents could be used to track down prohibited possessors.
You know, I think that was a great piece of legislation. And I think Governor Brown, Kamala Harris, the Department of Justice is now administering that. It's going to about 5 or 6 jurisdictions throughout the state, and not Long Beach.
Right. It's essentially, it's a state program, and no money is flowed down to the city of Long Beach as a city itself.
Right. I believe Los Angeles, Fresno, Sacramento. There are a few cities that are actually.
But you decided to take the bull by the horns, if I can use that cliche.
Yes.
And you looked at the situation and you said, well, Long Beach can do something on its own.
Right. Well, it actually started from our gun buyback program, our first ever in the city of Long Beach.
Right.
We actually held this year with Long Beach PD. Collected about 200 guns up in North Long Beach.
It's such an interesting concept, these gun buyback programs, where essentially someone brings a gun as a general proposition, no questions are asked, the gun is handed over, paid for.
They get a gift certificate to Target or Home Depot.
Whatever it may be, and that's all.
Right. And we collected about 200 guns.
Okay.
But one of the officers mentioned to me, he said, you know, are we getting the guns that we really want to off the streets?
Right.
He suggested looking at prohibited possessors. And so I looked a little further into this and started talking to a couple of my council colleagues, and we believed that, you know, it deserved a look, it deserved an effort from us to actually take action on it.
Is there a way for a municipality to figure out how many prohibited possessors are in their jurisdiction?
Well, like I said, there's a database in the state of California, and the Chief McDonald estimates
that's the chief of the Long Beach Police.
Right, a little over 3,000 prohibited possessors are in the city of Long Beach.
I mean, the city's only 500,000, although that's a big number, but that's 3,000 out of 500,000. I mean, that's significant.
So in our FY14 budget, our city council actually stepped up and appropriated funds to Long Beach PD to actually develop a task force to look at going after prohibited possessors in the city of Long Beach.
Oh, really?
They will do their investigation, and ultimately they will not go in and do their field research and knock on doors of individuals who are not supposed to have guns, and do their best to confiscate those guns from those individuals.
Assuming they have one? I mean, I guess we would know. I mean, would we know if they have one? I guess those 3,000, there's evidence in the database they have a gun, and there's a cross-reference which says that they're disqualified because of conviction, mental illness, TRO, wanted, whatever it may be.
Right.
So if you know, what then will happen? So Long Beach PD takes the gun. I presume that's a criminal violation to possess the gun.
You know, I don't want to go, I don't know.
You're not involved in that. I mean, it's just because it does beg the question, because, okay, so you grab the gun, and then what? Do you make a reference to the district attorney, to the city prosecutor?
Well, I will
Those
let
are
that
regulations.
system handle I think that system will bear out.
Right. Work itself out.
Yes. But the most important piece is getting those guns off of the streets from individuals who shouldn't have them. It should, I think, be high percentage work in terms of being able to hopefully prevent violent crime, gun crime in the future. So.
Well, especially when you think about the individuals that have had this determination made by a court. I mean, it's not easy to have your gun rights stripped. I mean, the Second Amendment is very clear. And the Supreme Court has made it very clear that they see the Second Amendment as a clear recitation of the right to bear arms.
I support the Second Amendment 100%, obviously, but if a judge has deemed somebody violent or dangerous or not stable to be in possession of a firearm, I think we need to take that very seriously.
Let me ask you, because it does go to the question of passing any legislation, any ordinance that deals with guns, because the issue is so sensitive and it's seen as such a hot potato. You see tremendous acrimony growing out of gun ordinances. I mean, in some states and jurisdictions, and I'm not commenting one way or the other, we have seen gun laws loosened since Sandy Hook. We look at California, they call us the lefty crazies, and we've seen gun laws tightened. So how was the debate in City Council over the prohibited possessors ordinance?
I think it was pretty unanimous. It received unanimous approval.
Okay.
We live in a city that's very diverse.
Right.
There are areas of the cities that actually is plagued by gun violence from time to time. I had a shooting just the day before yesterday that resulted in a fatality in
your district.
In my district. I think the city of Long Beach, the residents here in Long Beach get it. They understand it, particularly if we're looking to move reasonable violence prevention measures.
But again,
reasonable.
But what's reasonable to one person is not reasonable to another, and so it is. I mean, it's just so interesting to me as an observer of the process. In the wake of Sandy Hook, I would have bet $1 million that we would have seen some form of federal legislation come out of that incident, and instead we saw none. That doesn't mean I would want it or not want it. I just would have expected.
Well, our Congress can't.
That's a whole other conversation. But did you get hate mail because you were a proponent? Did you get love mail because you were a proponent?
Maybe two emails. I mean, we did not get a whole lot of feedback on that. Like I said, I think the efforts that our council made and obviously I championed were reasonable. They weren't intrusive in terms of intruding on individuals' right to possess arms. Obviously, we're going after those who are prohibited by law or by the courts at this point.
And so are you looking at further gun control initiatives? I mean, I look at, for example, in Los Angeles, the council called to ban large capacity magazines. A lot of cities are taking very bold steps. I mean, we know a lot of gun control legislation is percolating in Sacramento, a lot of bills before the governor. Are you still looking at the question, or it's...
We're definitely in support of a lot of the legislation that is actually being proposed in Sacramento. I sit on the state legislation committee for the city of Long Beach, along with two other council members, O'Donnell as well as our Vice Mayor Garcia.
Right, Patrick O'Donnell, Robert Garcia.
Our state legislation committee actually made a recommendation to approve a series of gun control legislation that actually is making its way through the state legislature, and the entire city council voted unanimously to support that just, I want to say 2 weeks ago.
It is remarkable to think that one city can be so united behind gun control questions, whereas another city will be so united behind gun right ordinances.
Well, I think we're doing all we can to put the space in terms of public safety on the city of Long Beach.
His name is Al Austin. He's a member of the Long Beach City Council. My name is Brad Palmer. Thank you so much for watching Charter California Edition.